My name is Paige Afton, and I am 32 years old. 3 days ago, I found myself sitting in a very quiet, very serious lawyer's office, reading a single piece of paper, and I started laughing. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The kind that keeps going after you try to stop it. The attorney put down his pen and looked at me with genuine concern and asked if I needed water. I didn't need water. I needed a moment to absorb the fact that my family, who had not spoken a single word to me in 2 full years, had finally made contact. Not to apologize, not to ask how I was doing, but to ask me to sign away my rights to my grandfather's lake house so they could sell it. They thought that paper was going to take something from me. What it actually did was hand me proof that someone in my life had seen exactly who I was and had spent years making sure I was protected. Let me take you back to where this really begins. I grew up just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, in the kind of small town where everyone knows your name and your business and has an opinion about both. My father, Gerald, managed a local bank. He wore perfectly pressed shirts to church and shook hands with people like he was running for office. My mother, Diane, led Bible study groups and organized church dinners and was the kind of woman that the whole community admired. From the outside, we looked like exactly the right kind of family. Inside the house, things were arranged differently. My younger sister, Meredith, 3 years behind me, was the one everything centered on. If there was money for piano lessons, Meredith got them. When I asked, I was told maybe next year. When Meredith turned 16, she got a car. When I turned 16, I got a bus pass and a speech about character. Meredith had the biggest bedroom in the house because she needed extra space for her things. I slept in a small room beside the laundry, falling asleep most nights to the sound of the washing machine running at midnight. My parents were never cruel in any obvious way. They never raised their voices at me, never made me feel unwanted in a way I could easily point to. That is what made it so difficult to explain, even to myself, for so many years. They simply treated me as a child who didn't need anything. Whenever I tried to name what felt unfair, my father would say the same thing every time. He would tell me that Meredith just needed more help than I did. He would tell me I was the strong one. I believed him for a long time. I wore that word like something I had earned. I worked double shifts at a diner all through high school. I bought my own prom dress. I paid for my own textbooks. I was the first person in my family to finish college, earning an accounting degree while working 25 hours a week at a tax office. For 4 years, my life was early alarms before sunrise, classes all day and late shifts into the night. I had no help from my parents, no one co-signing anything, no money, nothing. They promised they would be at my graduation. My mother even talked about the special outfit she had chosen for the day. I saved 4 seats at the ceremony, one for each of them, one for Meredith, and one for my grandfather, Howard. Howard Afton was the only person in my family who never treated me like an afterthought. He made me feel, consistently and without condition, like I mattered exactly as much as anyone else. On the morning of my graduation, my father called. He told me something had come up. Meredith was moving into a new apartment and needed help with her furniture. In the background, I could hear my mother asking where the tape gun was. She got on the phone long enough to tell me it was just a ceremony and that I already had the degree. So I walked across that stage alone. Afterward, I sat on a bench in the middle of strangers and balanced my phone on a stack of books to take my own photograph. That afternoon, Grandpa Howard called me. His voice sounded rough, like he was working very hard to hold himself together. He told me he was so proud of me. Then he said something I didn't quite understand at the time. He said, "Don't you worry about a thing. I already took care of it." I thought he meant a small gift. I had no idea he meant something that would change my life 7 years later. I met Daniel Reeves when I was 26. He was doing electrical work in the building where I had started a new job, and before I ever saw his face, I heard him singing a Johnny Cash song, off-key and completely committed to it. He was an electrician with his own small business, rough hands, worn-out boots, and a very old van. On our 3rd date, he showed up with wildflowers from a gas station because the flower shop had already closed, and he told me he didn't want to arrive empty-handed. I think I fell in love with him in that moment. We married 2 years later at the courthouse. Grandpa Howard had passed away by then, and every good thing in my life felt slightly smaller without him there to see it. My parents came to the wedding, but didn't stay long. At a family dinner the following week, my father looked across the table at Daniel, and then looked at me and said, very calmly, that he had really hoped I would do better than this. An electrician, he said, felt like I was moving backward. My mother said nothing. Meredith kept scrolling her phone. Daniel said nothing either. But on the drive home, he looked straight ahead at the road and said, I don't need your father to like my job, but he should at least respect you. I kept trying with my family. Anyway, I don't entirely know why, except that some part of me kept hoping that one day they would finally see me. Then came the Christmas that ended everything. 15 relatives packed into my parents' house. Music playing, food everywhere, everyone laughing. Meredith pulled me into the kitchen and asked for $5,000. It wasn't the first time, and she still hadn't paid back the money from the last 2 times I had helped her. She wanted it for a clothing store she was planning to open. I told her no. I was polite and I was clear. She walked back into the living room with tears already in her eyes, and within seconds my father was on his feet asking loudly, in front of everyone, what kind of sister refuses to help her own family? The whole room went still. My aunt stopped pouring punch. My cousin Rachel stared at me. My father said I had changed, and not for the better. Then my mother leaned toward my aunt and whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear, that she thought I needed professional help, that things had been different since I married that man. Not one person in that room said a word in my defense. I grabbed my coat. Daniel was already at the door with his keys. We walked out, and I didn't look back. The silence that followed felt like peace at first. No more guilt. No more being asked to rescue Meredith from her latest situation. No more managing my parents' feelings about my own life. But silence gives other people space to fill with their version of events. And that is exactly what my family did. They told people around town that I was mentally unwell. They told people Daniel was controlling me, keeping me from them. My cousin Rachel called once to ask if I was okay, whispering that my mother had been telling people I was having episodes. I had never even been to therapy. The story spread the way stories do in small towns, quickly and without my participation. One by one, relatives stopped texting. Birthday messages stopped coming. People I had known my whole life faded away. Daniel and I moved about 45 minutes out, far enough to breathe and close enough to drive back if we ever needed to. I got promoted to senior accountant. His business grew. We bought a small house with a porch and a big backyard, and it was genuinely peaceful. But every Christmas, I would look at my phone and wonder. No one ever called. Sometimes I would drive past Grandpa Howard's lake house. The paint had started to fade. The wooden dock leaned slightly toward the water. I would slow down, but never stop. Everything about that place carried his memory, and it was still too tender to sit with for long. 2 years of silence passed. Then one Tuesday morning, an envelope arrived from a law firm. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for 2 full days before I opened it. Anyone who has ever stopped speaking to their family and then received a legal letter knows exactly what those 2 days feel like. When I finally opened it Thursday morning, it said my father was planning to sell the lake house. Because I might have some legal interest in the property, they needed me to sign a quitclaim deed, a document relinquishing any claim I had. That was the entire letter. No apology, no hello, no acknowledgement that 2 years had passed in complete silence. Just a request for my signature. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I looked up at the shelf above my stove where Grandpa Howard's old wooden tackle box had been sitting for 7 years. I had taken it from his house after the funeral. Inside was an envelope he had left, with my name written on the front in his handwriting, and beneath it the words, "For Paige. Use this when you need it." I had never opened it. I opened it that night. Inside were 2 things. The first was a legal document establishing an irrevocable trust. The lake house was listed as the property. The sole beneficiary was me, Paige Afton. The second was a letter in his handwriting. He wrote that he knew my father, that my father meant well, but had never been able to see clearly when it came to Meredith. He wrote that the house had always been mine. He wrote, Don't let anyone tell you anything different. I sat on the floor of my bedroom and cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. Not the kind of crying that hollows you out, but the kind that closes something that has been open and bleeding for a very long time. He had seen everything. He had seen it before the Christmas dinner, before the silence, before any of it. He had quietly built a wall around something that was mine and trusted my grandmother to hold the key until I was ready. Daniel came home and found me on the floor, surrounded by papers. He sat down beside me without asking a single question and held my hand. The next morning, I called the attorney named on the trust documents, a man named Mr. Calloway. He told me the trust was entirely valid and that my father had never legally owned the house, not for a single day. I then called the attorney who had sent me the quitclaim deed and asked for a meeting. For the next 5 days, I prepared the way I prepare everything at work, methodically, without letting my feelings get ahead of my facts. I confirmed the trust through county records. I verified the timeline. The house had been placed in the trust before my grandfather died, which meant it had never passed through his estate at all. My father had filed documents assuming ownership of something he had no claim to. My cousin Rachel called the night before the meeting and told me, in a whisper, that Meredith's clothing store was failing and that my father had borrowed heavily against his own home trying to keep open. He owed close to $180,000. He was counting on the sale of the lake house to save himself. Rachel told me he had told people I would sign without much trouble. He had said, I always came through when the family needed me. I drove back to my hometown on a Friday morning. I knew every turn without thinking. The lawyer's office was downtown above a dentist's office. My father was already inside when I arrived, shirt perfectly pressed, posture straight, that practiced look of calm authority on his face. He said hello as though we had simply seen each other recently. He suggested we get this done quickly. He said the house was sitting empty and that selling it was a sensible thing for the whole family. Then he said my grandfather would have wanted them to do this. That was the hardest sentence to hear. He was using Grandpa Howard's name the way he had always used everything. As a tool. I let him finish. I looked at the lawyer and said very calmly that this was the first time my father and I had spoken in 2 years, and that he hadn't yet asked how I was doing. My father looked genuinely surprised. He said he had tried to reach me. I told him my phone number had never changed. The room went quiet. He pushed forward anyway, told me not to make things complicated, told me not to be difficult, then looked at the lawyer and said sadly that I had been struggling and that he worried my husband was influencing my decisions. The same story, 2 years later, in a lawyer's office. Then his phone buzzed on the table. He answered it without thinking. It was Meredith, and her voice was loud enough to fill the room. She asked if I had signed yet. He tried to cover the phone, but she kept going. She said to just tell me it was for the family, because I always gave in when he said that. The room went completely still. My father's face went red. I repeated her words back quietly. She always gives in when you say that. He stood up and told me to just sign the paper. I reached into my bag and placed the trust documents on the table. I watched the lawyer pick them up and start reading. I watched my father's expression shift from impatience to confusion to something I had never seen on his face before. The lawyer took off his glasses and asked my father if he had known about the trust. My father whispered that it couldn't be right. Mr. Calloway joined by phone and confirmed everything. The trust was valid. The house had never belonged to my father. The document they wanted me to sign was meaningless. I wasn't giving up anything because there was nothing to contest. The meeting ended. As I was leaving, my father said my name. I stopped. I thought for a moment about the man who taught me to ride a bike and carried me through the mud the day I lost my shoe in the rain. That man had been real once. I told him my phone number had never changed, and I walked out. They drove to the lake house that afternoon, my parents and Meredith, and stayed there, acting as though nothing had been decided. Meredith posted photographs online from the porch, sitting in the green wooden chair my grandfather had built himself, the one I helped him sand when I was 10 years old. Mr. Calloway sent a formal notice, giving them 72 hours to leave. My mother called before the deadline. She sounded exhausted. She told me I was breaking the family apart. I told her this hadn't started with the house. She said my grandfather would be ashamed of what I was doing. I told her I had a letter from him that said something very different. There was a long silence. Then she told me I had changed. I looked at Daniel sitting beside me on the edge of the bed and said that I really hoped so. They left before the deadline. I waited a week before I went back. When I arrived, the sky was gray and everything was quiet. The door was unlocked. Inside it smelled like pine and dust, and something I couldn't quite name except that it felt like memory. My mother had cleaned the kitchen before leaving. On the table there was a single key and a short note in my father's handwriting. It said, "This was never about the money, Dad." I folded it and put it in my pocket and walked down to the dock. I sat in my grandfather's chair and looked at the water, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely still. Daniel and I repaired the dock and re-stained the porch and fixed the wiring inside. One afternoon, I found a box of old photographs in the garage. One of them showed me at 6 years old, holding a fish almost as big as I was, and Grandpa Howard standing behind me laughing his enormous laugh. I looked at that photo for a long time. He hadn't just left me a house. He had left me evidence that someone had seen me clearly, not as the strong one or the easy one, or the daughter who could survive without love, but simply as Paige, as someone worth protecting. I framed the photograph and hung it in the kitchen. I wrote a letter to my parents a month later. I didn't send it through anyone. It was just from me. I told them the house would stay in the trust. I told them that if we were ever going to have any kind of relationship again, it would have to begin with honesty, with them seeing me as their daughter rather than as someone who could be depended on to absorb whatever they chose not to give. I told them my door was open, but only to people who came without an agenda. I mailed it and didn't sit waiting for a response. On a quiet Friday afternoon, I was sitting on the dock with my grandfather's old fishing rod. Daniel was inside making coffee. The lake was still, and the air smelled like cedar and grass. I hadn't caught anything, and it didn't matter. I looked out across the water, and I whispered thank you to no one in particular and to the one person who deserved it most. Because I finally understood what he had meant all those years ago on the phone, his voice rough with emotion, telling a girl in a graduation gown not to worry. He had already taken care of it, and he had.